morning, everybody. This is Terence Corrigan speaking to you from a chilly Johannesburg, a city much in the news lately. What with the potholes that one can swim in, the water spills that one can row a dinghy over, and the taps that often don't produce a steady stream, mostly because that's filling up the potholes. Infrastructure is the theme of today, and I'm joined today by my colleague and IRR analyst Anlu Keeve. She has been working on a study of South Africa's infrastructure, reinforcing growth through infrastructure, another one of the IRR's Blueprint for Growth papers, to give us a sense of what the country needs in order to get that depressing growth rate up. For the last 2 decades, we've sort of hovered in the 1 to 3% zone. But to really get things moving in South Africa, to cater for the population, to start making a dent in unemployment, we need at a minimum 5% per annum for a protracted period. Those are kind of the official projections. We are more ambitious and say that we need to aim for something more like 7%. And what the blueprints try to do is to illustrate how we can up the game in particular areas. Now, infrastructure, the hard sinews of the economy, the superstructure on which everything is built, or the substructure and the foundations on which everything is built. If we can't move our goods, if we can't drink the water, if we can't if we can't power our homes and businesses, South Africa is going nowhere. So Anlu is you will be talking us through what the state of play is and what needs to be done. After which, we'll be happy to take some questions from members of the audience. I encourage you to please write your columns in the chat. We'll keep an eye on them, and then when Anlu's finished her presentation, we can have a discussion. Anlu, over to you.
Thank you, Terence. If you'll allow me a moment, I will share my screen. There we go. Okay. Very well. Sorry, now it's always a thing to work with double screens. Here we go. That's that. Excellent. Thank you, Terence, for the introduction, and welcome to all of you in the audience. As Terence mentioned, this is the latest iteration of the Institute's Blueprint for Growth series. And if this is your first time interacting with our research, the series is focused on putting forth recommendations to get South Africa's economy growing. And this particular paper in the series is essentially a survey of the physical systems that the economy runs on. That includes the water, electricity, rail, roads, and ports, and what has gone wrong in each of these systems. The paper also draws on official data throughout. This includes data produced by the state's own departments and entities, as well as external research. And at the end, it puts forward a set of recommendations that are you'll find deliberately unexciting, and that is because the fix here is mostly a matter of policy. So South Africa has been trapped in a cycle of damaging, I almost want to call it a policy infrastructure growth loop, since about 2008. And our income per capita is a very good indicator of this, because it's now lower than it was 17 years ago. So the purpose of this specific paper is to show how South Africa's infrastructure failure and this prolonged economic stagnation that we've experienced are closely related. Over the next half an hour, 40 minutes or so, we'll lay out exactly why it is the fastest and most reliable way to turn around that stagnating per capita income number, and how much of the answers we are looking for is actually sitting in the resources that we already have. So everything that will follow in this webinar will follow on or rest on these three propositions. So I want to put them on the table from the start. The first is that growth is a binding constraint. Okay, so whatever you care about most in this country, if it is jobs, if it's crime, if it's schools, if it's the budget or the fiscus, if it's whether it's immigration or inequality, whatever it is, the room to fix it is coming from a growing economy. So without growth, every one of those debates becomes a fight over how to divide that shrinking pie or shrinking pot, whichever way you want to refer to it. The second is that infrastructure runs in both directions. Now, when water and power and the railways actually work, they lift up economic activity or they increase economic activity. And the contrary is also true, that when they fail, they actually draw down economic activity, which will then deter investment. And those investments are exactly the things that would in turn have helped to recover the economic output. And this essentially then forms this loop that tightens on itself. And once it does, it is very expensive to stop. And then the third proposition is one that matters most, and it's one that I will keep coming back to. Every technical failure in the country that we've seen has a policy parent. Whether it is a pipe that has burst, whether it is load shedding, which we are so familiar with, whether it is a railway station that hasn't worked or a locomotive that hasn't been delivered, there's a decision behind it, a decision about who got appointed, who got awarded a contract, who was allowed to compete for that contract. So the failures that we see, that is only the symptom of the policy decisions that has already been made. Okay, so we're going in today's agenda, we're going to first set out why infrastructure is a growth question and the economic context that we are in. We'll then look at the three sections in turn. We'll look at water, electricity, and railroad and ports. And then we'll tie it all together by just laying out exactly why the same story is playing out across all three of those sectors. Okay. So that first number that I referred to, the per capita income one, that is where we'll start off. So in 2008, the real GDP per capita in South Africa was about $14,300. And that's measured in constant 2021 purchasing power parity terms. And we do this so that we can compare fairly across countries. And by 2025, it was at $13,592. And if we look at the company that we keep, so as examples here, we've included Colombia, Brazil, and Malaysia. And this is because it's middle income countries that have resource endowments a lot like ours. So they face the same commodity cycles that we do, and they've had the same pandemic and so forth. And all of their per capita incomes have gone up. You'll see Malaysia quite a lot, actually. And then we've also included the world average, and that went up by almost 40%. So this is the economic context in which we find ourselves. As South Africans, we are poorer today in real GDP per capita terms than we were 17 years ago. And at this point of the presentation, I just want to be careful that it's easy to start listing all the grievances going forward from here. But that's not the purpose of this presentation. The reason I start with this chart is to set the size of the prize. If we had tracked the world average increase in GDP per capita since 2008, us as South Africans would have been in a much more tangibly better position than we are at the moment. And the arguments that we are having at the moment about how to split our resources would have been a much more easy one to have. So one of the indicators that we're also looking at is gross fixed capital formation. And this is a useful measure because it gives us an idea of the confidence in our country's future. So the gross fixed capital formation essentially tells us how much is being spent on infrastructure or buildings or machinery. And in that way, it tells us what is being spent on the things that can actually expand the economy's productive capacity. And if often we like to think of at the Institute of Gross Fixed Capital Formation as a long-term vote of confidence in the country. So when your gross fixed capital formation goes up or it increases, it means that firms and government are willing to actually bet on the future of the country. And when it doesn't go up, we know that the future perhaps looks too uncertain, too risky, or there's just better opportunities elsewhere. And the capital then goes there. So as you'll see on this graph, it tells a very sobering story. South Africa's gross fixed capital formation is currently sitting at almost 14% of GDP. And we know that the National Development Plan set a total target for our gross fixed capital formation of 30% of GDP for 2030. Now, since 1994, we've only achieved 20% once. And that was around 2008, 2009, as you'll see they're roughly in the middle of the graph. There's projections for our gross fixed capital formation to go up in the next couple of years. But I mean, we are 5 years away from the target. We are not even halfway there. So whatever the projections are, they're not nearly high enough to bring us closer to that 30% target. So South Africa's fixed investment ratio would have to, both in terms of the contribution from the public sector side and the private sector side, both of those elements would have to almost double in the next 5 years for us to even reach that 2030 goal. And if we look a little bit and we do the arithmetic behind it, then something becomes very obvious to me. And that is that 2/3, and this is if we keep to the traditional 2-1 ratio, 2-to-1 ratio from the private to the public investment, we see that there is 2/3 that will need to be, 2/3 of the weight will need to be carried by the private sector. That means private capital. So there's no version of this 2030 goal where the government can build its own way to that 30% target. And there's also no way in which it can borrow its way there. And that's for reasons on the next slide. So let's have a look at that. So why has investment not happened? And part of the reason for that is that the state has been absorbing money that would have paid for those investments. Our gross government debt now sits at 78.9% of GDP. And this is the highest ratio since 1947. We see that 21.3 cents of every rand that the government collects in revenue goes directly towards servicing that debt. So that means before we pay anything else, that just goes to our debt. Servicing our debt, not the debt directly, just servicing it. And then what we need to understand about these two elements is that when the state borrows on this scale, it essentially soaks up the economy's lending capacity, which then pushes up interest rates. So businesses will then borrow less, so that the capital that would have otherwise been invested on their behalf. So in this way, the state crowds out the funding that would have actually helped to build the industrial capacity and the infrastructure base that could carry the economy of South Africa. And then there's a third element to this, which is worth putting because it's slightly bit more hopeful. We have that plan from government to spend R1 trillion over a 3-year period, starting last year, ending next year. So the money isn't entirely absent. It is not possible for government to fund it alone or borrow to fund it alone. But the major concern regarding that R1 trillion is whether the institutions that receive it are actually in the condition to turn what they receive into working infrastructure. And on the evidence of the last decade, I think that question answers itself. Okay, so there's just one more piece of theory before we get to the pipes or the electricity. And we need to understand this so that we can understand why infrastructure matters for South Africa's economy and why it will enable growth in the country. So the slide rests on a very simple idea. If you invest, whether this is in new capacity or existing capacity, so maintaining that capacity, that investment makes our labor and our capital more productive. So because people and machines can now get done more, we have more productive capacity. And higher production attracts more production. So we see these clusters form. And those clusters involve both firms and talent and capital. They all come to systems that work. And that clustering then lifts up economic activity, which creates more output, and in that way then raises the revenue and the tax base, which can then fund the next round of investments. And I want you to just for 1 second notice what this has a geographic effect as well. And we refer to it as the cores are the areas where clustering happens, and the peripheries are the areas that clustering don't happen. Those are the areas where the systems don't work as well. And we see in the data how the cores are pulling ahead and the peripheries are falling behind. And Limpopo and the Eastern Cape are very clear examples of exactly this effect, where a young person in the Eastern Cape is not competing on a level field with a young person in Sandton or in Cape Town city centre. And the reason for that has a great deal to do with whether there's a pipe and a tap with water in it, and whether there's a road that leads to the nearest town. Okay, so that's the framework. We've laid it out. We understand why infrastructure is important for economic growth. Now we will start with the actual evidence, starting with water. So let's have a look at what happened to our drinking water systems over the past decade. And the findings that we present here are from the National Blue Drop Report. These are released by the Department of Water and Sanitation. And this round of data represents data from the 2021-22 audit cycle. They have started with the latest round for 23-24, but that data will only come out next year because this specific indicator only happens every 2 years that they measure for it. So in 2014, we had 174 water supply systems that were in critical condition. This means that these systems are operating at rates that are not supposed to. They are in critical condition. It speaks for itself. In 2023, we had 277 systems classified as critical. We see between 2014 and 2023, fewer systems are classified as poor, but in the critical and poor categories, there are now more systems classified as critical and poor than there were in 2014. We also see that the systems classified as average has dropped from 444 systems to 373 systems. And then we see the systems that are classified at the top end of performance. This is both for your good and excellent categories. Those have also decreased from 129 in the good to 108, and the excellent category has almost halved from 44 systems to 26 systems. Those 26 systems are the only systems that receive Blue Drop certification, which means that they are scoring on the water supply system. They have a score above 95%, indicating excellent performance. So what this tells us is that we can see the drinking water distribution systems in the country is shifting in the wrong direction. More systems are being classified as critical and poor, and less systems are being classified as good and excellent. So this is a national view, but we also have to look at the individual view. How does this affect households? The micro view. And this gets a little bit more personal because it is personal. And what we see here, I want to just start on the left hand with the data. The 86.5%, that represents the amount of households that had access to piped or tapped water in 2004. And in 2025, we see that it's 87.4%. So we've had 2 decades of efforts for 1 percentage point increase in piped or tapped water. So we can clearly identify that there is a difference between having access to piped or tapped water and actually having water in those taps. And for this, we've included an additional indicator which looks at the percentage of households that report water interruptions lasting for at least 2 days. We see here that 37.6% of households nationally, that's the light blue line, reported water interruptions lasting at least 2 days. We can also see that peripheries and cores that we referred to in the previous section. The Western Cape has reported the least interruptions lasting 2 days, whereas the Northwest has reported the most interruptions lasting 2 days. You're welcome to also have a look at the actual paper or report. There are various indicators on the intervals of water interruptions and how often they happen. Okay, so from here on, it's also important for us to understand that the funding to improve and maintain South Africa's water supply systems is a structural problem, and much of this sits at the municipal level. So to understand and conceptualize this, we have the National Water and Sanitation Master Plan of 2018, and that gives us an idea of the funding. We see in that report, between 2018 and 2028, they projected that there will be 90 billion rand required to maintain these systems. Of that, we see we will only collect almost 60 billion rand, and we'll have a shortfall of more than 30 billion rand. Now, the obvious response to this is to perhaps borrow what is needed for that red section. Infrastructure is a long-lived asset, and borrowing against that is pretty normal. I mean, that is why we have municipal debt markets. But this doesn't quite work. And the reason for this is that tariffs supply roughly 80% of the funding for water and sanitation, which makes up that required sections that we need. And municipalities fail to recover even their operating costs. We've seen Treasury also recently withholding funding due to the inefficiencies when it comes to recovering costs and allocating budget. On top of this, exactly this point, municipalities failing to recover their operating costs, both because of non-payment, but also because of the scale of free basic services that are provided and how hard it is to actually account for these services. And then, of course, we have the cumulative effect of this, which is the weak cost recovery and the poor billing that has damaged the creditworthiness of these municipalities. And that closes off the possibility to finance and to borrow from sources. So this also gives us a sense of the sequence in which we have to fix things so that it can work. We first have to fix the billing and the collection before we can look at creating a system where the money will actually arrive in. The ability to collect money or to borrow money depends on the system actually working. Okay, so What has caused this? What we're dealing with today, the dry taps, the failing pumps, in many cases, the tanker mafias that have established themselves because of the problems. These are the results of broken policy. After 1998, water was nationalized in South Africa, and that shifted control away from the local users and made everything subject to state approval. So it opened the door to political interference in licensing and procurement and appointments. And instead of seeing engineers and skilled professionals, including managers and staff, being appointed to run the systems, we've actually seen decisions being politicized, and in many cases, technical expertise being replaced, or people with technical expertise being replaced with loyalists. At the same time that this was happening, we've also seen private capital being pushed out. The policy environment became hostile to investments and innovation, and in that way, and in that way to the delivery of, service delivery through private public partnerships. So you can also see here on the list, we have the lack of maintenance. And one of the ways that we measure this is by looking at the infrastructure leakage index. For this, we know that in over a course of 10 years, between 2013 and 2023, the physical water losses has drastically worsened. In 2013, it was 4 points, meaning that physical water losses were still manageable, but by 2023, it was 7.0, which is essentially a sign of severe physical losses and mismanagement. And we see in several provinces how more than half of water is even lost before it reaches a tap. We've also seen non-payment of contractors, theft and vandalism, non-operational boreholes, and the lack of flow monitoring, inconsistency in technical and maintenance capacity, and in very often irregular and inaccurate data. We see in the 2023 Blue Drop report that 45% of the municipalities that were observed couldn't actually provide the most basic information, including monthly consumption figures. So from here, I want to just show you two South African counterexamples of successful case studies, essentially, and they've been running for 2 decades. So South Africa Waterworks, that's a private company that manages water concessions in KwaZulu-Natal and Mpumalanga. And South African Waterworks essentially exemplifies the success of public-private partnerships in a lease agreement model. You're welcome to have a look at the paper to understand the context of these case studies. But in both cases, both service providers, Caesar Water and Silulamanzi, they are operating in 30-year agreements since 1999. And over the course of this period, we've seen, for example, Caesar Water managed to cut their water losses from 50% at inception to 8% in 2021. And they've received a 97% collection rate on the services that they provide. And of course, one of their standout achievements is that is the construction and operation of a direct water reuse plant, which now produces 3 million liters of potable water daily. And Silulumanzi is a similarly wonderful, successful story. And one of its standout achievements is that it was the only service provider in Mpumalanga to have received Blue Drop certification in the 2023 audit cycle. And the reason I chose these 2 case studies specifically is because their accomplishments exemplify or underline how public-private partnerships can effectively improve water infrastructure and service delivery to benefit communities directly. And they have both set very high standards for public-private partnerships. The paper also puts forward recommendations, and most of the recommendations follow the logic that we first have to depoliticize the government and then we can fix the operations. And it has to happen in that order. Otherwise, the practical implementations that we do will not have the desired outcome. Some of the recommendations include shifting control from municipalities to independent water regulators, appointing qualified professionals, and that will help to root out the corruption, to prioritize loss and non-revenue water management, expanding the use of public-private partnerships and lease models that do exist, like in the case of Caesar and Silulumanzi, improving municipal asset management, running targeted skills programs, and finally, we can't leave rural areas behind. It is very important that we have rural water investment, and it must be ring-fenced and prioritized, or the gap that we see between the cores and the peripheries, as we've previously mentioned, will only grow. So from here, we'll look at the electricity sector, and this is one of the sections that genuinely has some good news, and I want to give credit where credit is due, but we will also introduce some complications in the sector. So the generation fleet has stabilized. Let's start there. There's 4 indicators that we're going to use to actually show this. The first is, of course, the days of load shedding that we've had. I'm sure we've noticed. In 2024, we had almost 330 days of load shedding. Going into 2025, only 13 days, and we haven't had load shedding in 2026 so far. Secondly, the unplanned capacity loss factor that has also come down from 30.8% to 19.6%. And then thirdly, we see that the diesel spend on the emergency turbines that has also fallen by nearly 89%. And that is from 3.6 billion rand that was spent to 566 million rand. So those turbines were essentially run as part of the base load, and they are now instead actually being used in the way that they are designed to be used. And then, of course, we have the South Africa's electricity supply system. Our supply system capacity is captured in the energy availability factor, and this is expressed as a share of installed generation capacity available to produce power. So this is essentially a measure that just takes account of the energy losses, both in terms of that resulting from the planned maintenance and those resulting from equipment failures. So in 1999, this is just as context, we saw that our energy availability factor stood at 91%. Then when the first rounds of the power crisis came, we saw it standing at still a respectable 87.5%. And in 2012-13, it dipped below 80%, come 2018-19 below 70%, and then it reached that wonderful 54.7% in 2023. Over the course of this period, then essentially we can say that the energy availability factor fell by 35 percentage points. Currently, we are sitting at 66%, and that's a great deal better than the 54%, but there's still a long way to go for us to actually build the capacity and to recover the generation capacity to the level that a country needs if the country wants to actually industrialize. Briefly, why have we seen this stabilization in the generation fleet? Maintenance. We've also seen private generation that was allowed in to assist, and at a scale much larger than we actually anticipated. And of course, we've then seen improvements in the rules that actually govern how electricity is generated. And that points back to the point, which is that behind every failure we've had, we've seen a policy decision. From here, we have to introduce the complication. So between 1988 and 2007, Eskom tariffs rose 223%. At the same time, inflation rose at 335%. Comparing that to the period between 2007 and 2026, brace yourselves. Tariffs increased 1,172%, and headline inflation increased 174%. So the cost of electricity increasing over the past 2 decades, that is the cost of deferring our maintenance, not expanding our capacity, having the 2 electricity power stations coming in late, way over budget, with plenty of design faults. Through those 2 decades, somebody was always going to pay for those costs, and households and businesses ended up paying that cost by paying more for electricity. It's not all over either, so it's not the end of it. On the left-hand side, you'll see that there are already approved increases way above inflation. And for exactly this reason, I'm very wary of declaring the electricity crisis as finished or finalized. The blackouts may have stopped, but the operational recovery we have clearly seen does not mean that we will have price relief. Okay, so we of course have to look at what has caused this. Let me also take a sip of coffee. Okay, so again, the initial crisis came from a failure to invest in generation capacity. And by the time that we saw the new power stations being commissioned, the shortages has become so damaging that it was already part of everyday life. And then, of course, the newly built stations significantly exceeded budget and took far longer than they were supposed to. And, of course, with plenty of faults. Then we've also seen the long-standing reluctance to actually include the private provision of electricity. We've seen the failure to invest in our generation capacity, which I just mentioned, failure to conduct the necessary maintenance to the existing capacity and generation fleet, those delays, the cost overruns and design flaws, the falling sales, which is actually raising the unit prices. Because private generation has now entered into the system, Eskom is selling less and less electricity, and because of that, they still have to cover their operational costs, so they have to increase their unit prices. And at the same time, we see municipalities owing enormous amounts of money to Eskom, and Eskom's failure to collect those outstanding accounts or bills, and their failure to prioritize bill collection has definitely put them in this position. Okay, so from here, if you want to know whether there's a fixable solution, there are multiple developing countries that offer proof of first struggling and unsuccessful government-run distribution companies, and ones which have then turned around through the right mix of regulatory reform and private sector participation. And Uganda's experience is a very good example of this. So UMEME is a very relevant example here. Before the concession in 2005, the Ugandan Electricity Board was struggling to actually deal with power outages. They were losing 4 kilowatts per hour of every 10 kilowatts per hour that they were actually producing. And then after unbundling and granting it was a 20-year concession to UMEME, there were major turnarounds. We see that they were actually able to increase their distribution efficiency by 33 percentage points from 50% to 83%. They were able to decrease their losses from 38% to 18%, and the access to electricity through the grid connections were expanded enormously. So you are welcome to go and have a look in the paper at exactly this case study and the context surrounding it. On the recommendation side, removing red tape that is blocking new generation capacity. We have seen some improvements here, but there is still some outstanding recommendations that can be followed up on. Splitting Eskom into generation, transmission, and distribution. This has been partly implemented. We know that transmission was legally separated into the National Transmission Company in 2024. It is still an Eskom subsidiary. And then, of course, we have Eskom Generation and Eskom Distribution that have not yet had that legal separation. Further, we can also seek exemptions from costly green mandates, which the country cannot afford at the moment. The paper also makes recommendations for including nuclear options, and you're welcome to have a look at that in the paper. Okay, so from here on, we'll have a look at the transport sector. And this is perhaps one of the sections where the cost failures is the easiest to put a number on. And there are various external research points that has been included in the paper. You're welcome to go have a look there as well. So what you'll see here on the screen is as rail capacity declined, road kind of had to step in and transport were more moved onto roads. And we see firstly here rail that has stayed roughly the same, actually decreased from 214 million tons to 168 million tons. And road freight at the same time has actually increased from 521 million tons to 975 million tons. And by 2025, then we see that the road to rail ratio by tonnage was 6:1. Now, this shift is very expensive. It's more costly per ton. It's much worse for emissions. It destroys the roads, which then, of course, has to be rebuilt, which is very costly. And we already are very budget constrained. And it puts a heavier burden on trucks. And we've seen one of the indicators being truck hijackings, which has enormously increased over the course of 10 or so years. So we also have to look at the ports, and here the numbers really speak for themselves. The Container Port Performance Index ranks roughly 400 facilities. Those are the 2023 and 2024 rankings, and you can see that between Cape Town and Durban, they are genuinely going for the last positions. In 2024, out of 403 facilities that were ranked, Durban, Gqeberha came in 395th, Cape Town 400, and Durban came in the very last position. And the failure to reform our port operations has been hurting industry. Those costs are being translated. The cost of congestion is being translated into the industries and businesses who rely on these ports, both for exports and imports. And that cost ultimately transfers to the consumer. Okay, here we have transport is the same as the other sectors. There are several good case studies of international examples, but also not too far from us, where successful partnerships between the state and the private sector has actually improved the transport sector. The N4 highway stretches 567 kilometers from Pretoria to Maputo, and it was concessioned to Trans-Africa Concessions in 1997 under a 30-year term. And we've seen major sections of it being rebuilt and being operated at much better capacities. And one of the most important lessons that we can take away from the N4 Maputo corridor is that effective coordination can take place between public and private partnerships, at least on shorter routes, less than 1,000 kilometers. The Nagala corridor is also a very important successful story, and this is for one of the important reasons when we think of public-private partnerships, which is that for public-private partnership to be successful, we need large-scale capital to be raised for infrastructure and, of course, rolling stock, and that without actually sacrificing operational efficiency or public oversight. And the Nagala corridor is a wonderful example of that. Perhaps in the discussions afterwards, Terence, we can refer back to some of these case studies because they are very interesting, and I'm checking my clock, seeing that we are quite short on time. Some of the recommendations here is to create a railway police unit to prevent theft and vandalism, to open a transparent process for these concession-based upgrades, to actually expand the public-private partnership models in such a way that it actually suits the needs and the gaps that are in the system, to establish consultation networks, to prioritize repairs, to hold regular meetings with freight and trucking industry groups. This is one of the things that we've seen come out of external industry research, and of course to digitalize container tracking between ports and packhouses. That's also one of the indicators that we've seen lacking, as external research has shown. So this is perhaps one of the most important sections, so I'm going to just take a moment for it. So we've looked at all three sectors, and I hope that you've noticed I've kind of been telling the exact same story just 3 times. And that is that all of this traces back to a governing approach. And the approach that we've seen is one where they've centralized control, they've politicized appointment and procurement, and they've in that way made room for corruption and treated private investment more as a threat than as a partner. And this, of course, as a result, has had the cumulative effect of closing off capital, innovation, and the expertise that we actually needed in these industries. I'm happy to, perhaps in the discussions as well, go through some of these policy decisions that has brought us to the point where we are at the moment. So we are essentially asking for 4 things. A point for competence. We need qualified professionals in technical posts, and we need procurement that actually rewards competence and nothing else. We need to make the money work, and by this I mean we need bills to be collected, we need costs to be recovered, and this is because it affects creditworthiness. And our ability of our public institutions to borrow sustainably. We need to let private capital in, concessions, leases, partnerships. There are wonderful case studies of where it has worked, which we can take lessons from, both in terms of what to do and what not to do. And lastly, we need to fix the boring things first. This is very important. The maintenance, the meters, monitoring, the actual data that goes into it. The unglamorous work is really what prevents the expensive failures at the end of the day. And almost every catastrophic breakdown that we've seen and that the paper points to is because of maintenance that somebody deferred. So I'm going to end here, and I want to end with the same statistic that I used when I started, which is that South Africans has been going backwards in per capita terms for the past 17 years. And at the end of the day, nothing that this paper puts forth is new ideas. We see how Uganda did it. Companies in South Africa is already doing it. These policy decisions are set out with wonderful examples of where it has worked. The country has the capital, it has the expertise. What has been missing is the decision to let the people who can do the work and get it done, to let them in. And if we make that decision, we can see cities where the water arrives every day. If you turn the tap, there's water. If you switch on your light, there's electricity. If you want to use a port, you have the option of rail or road. And in per capita terms, then firstly, the economy can grow, and the living conditions of South Africans can improve in per capita terms. Terence, that is all from me. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions.
Well, thank you, Anlu. I think that I speak for everyone listening that this was as Michael Peter says, a brilliant analysis and presentation. Thank you. And there's been a very engaging discussion in the chat. Unfortunately, I won't be able to go through everything. There's a few comments that I would like to just pick out and ask your opinion about. The question of BEE comes up a few times. Preferential procurement. One comment here from Andrew Kenny said, "Good talk, but you left out a major cause of Eskom's failure: BEE and cadre deployment." Now, I would submit that you didn't actually do that, but would you like to speak to this again? The use of use of these institutions for something other than the delivery of energy, or for that matter, for their specific tasks.
Yeah. Well, I'd perhaps like to also agree with you, Terence. Perhaps in the discussion of this webinar, purely for the fact that it's a time constraint, I haven't specifically referred to BEE and cadre deployment, but the paper does refer to it, and the paper makes mention of exactly the policy choices, which at the end of the day give power to BEE policy and cadre deployment to take place, and how that has actually affected, firstly, the electricity sector, but all the sectors that we have discussed today. We see the same effects playing out in water, in electricity, and in our transport sectors. I think the biggest damage to the electricity sector specifically was a combination of those things, a combination of cadre deployment, the weak government, the procurement failures, and those things has then fed through to maintenance not happening and the technical expertise not being present. The Zondo Commission, of course, found extensive evidence that the politically connected appointments and the procurement decisions at Eskom actually weakened the institution and in that way enabled state capture. That obviously contributed to the billions of rands that we've had in cost overruns and the decline in performance that we've seen at the plants. And of course, as we're familiar, the years of load shedding that we had. On BEE specifically, of course, there's the very legitimate concerns that the ownership and the procurement requirements actually make projects much more complex, and it raises the transaction costs involved. It deters investment, and it deters investment, particularly when it comes to compliance costs, and that becomes more important when we're thinking, the system has kind of made the compliance more important than the actual technical capabilities. So at the end of the day, I think it has certainly had an effect, and it's had a very detrimental effect, and we've been paying the cost of that. It's not been actually benefiting us.
Look, I would just add that the politicization of these institutions, that in itself, I think, is a problem. It's a constitutional problem, and it's a corporate governance problem. But I think it's also made them very vulnerable to criminal capture. And I've been told that an issue that we have in the local sphere is that people who were appointed for their loyalty to a particular party in 5 or 10 years have found that loyalty is now being sort of funneled into loyalty to a criminal syndicate. And while they may still wear the T-shirt or whatever, this is sort of pulled outside the realm of let's say legitimate politics. I think the Zondo Commission was actually was even more scathing of Transnet than it was of Eskom, which is really something. That we are talking about different degrees of disaster.
Terence, can I just add to that? I noticed a comment from Toby Chance that said, I'm assuming a rhetorical question, but that the ending on long-term conveyor belt coal supply contracts in favor of new BBBEE suppliers delivering by truck also not increase costs. And we've seen that exact thing play out by trying to implement this exact policy choice. We've seen costs increase across the board in essentially all three sectors that we've addressed today. Right. And that's only focusing on the three sectors that we've addressed today.
Sure. Michael Peter and a little further down, Stuart Pennington, both made remarks that referred to the question of centralization, in particular the white paper on local government that wants to, the implication seems to be that it will envisages a future in which local tier municipalities are abolished and collapsed into district councils. Will this deal with the problem or not? To which I will respond, watch the space, because a paper on the future of local government is in process and will hopefully be out in the next few weeks. I would just say that there has been a centralizing impulse that goes back to the 1990s. People often forget that the 257 odd municipalities we have today were amalgamated out of, I think it was 850 or thereabouts. A city like a metropolitan area like Johannesburg consists of multiple local areas. My response to this is no. I don't think it will be useful, and I think that this is because the pathologies at local government level are so widespread that even that it will simply overwhelm the few centers of excellence that do exist. I imagine that abolishing local tier municipalities in somewhere like the Western Cape, where there's a concentration of generally well-functioning institutions, that will probably not have an enormous effect. But if one takes somewhere like KwaZulu-Natal, I think that it means taking, as I say, a very small number of functional centers and essentially swamping them with things that don't work. And I think we actually need an entire rethink about the way local authorities are conceived. I don't know if you'd like to add anything.
Perhaps just one of the things. So, the problem I think with some of it is that economies of scale don't automatically translate into better governance, and in many cases, I think decision-making will end up being moved further away from the communities, and in that way, accountability will actually be weakened. One of the things that, and this is not a DA advert, definitely not, I just recently watched it and want to point to it, but one of the recent videos out of Helen Zille's campaign trail is where she walked through Hillbrow, and she visited a park that was set up and restored, completely redone actually. And a year later, the park was essentially destroyed, and much of the equipment or playstations that were installed were broken down or stolen. And one of the things that she constantly focuses on is that the community is accountable, and once responsibility is given to communities, there's a sense of investment that communities have and incentive to keep the things around them nice. And in that way, I have to agree with you, Terence, that I'm not entirely convinced that it will have the positive effect that it is intended to have.
All right. Look, we're at 11 o'clock. I wonder, would you indulge us for another 10 minutes? If anybody there's an interesting question here. Is Business for South Africa speaking to the government about appointing for competence? I think the reality is that business. Well, first of all, there's the conceptual problem. What is business? Management institutions and whatever often have to consolidate competing interests, some of which are, look, I think let's be candid here. Not all of business or all of civil society are necessarily the good guys. There is a constituency that finds dysfunction quite congenial. I think one of the problems that South Africa has, though, is that business is that government fundamentally distrusts business. I think this is, to an extent, ideological. To an extent, it's a matter of simply not understanding how it functions and the incentives at play. But it seems to me that is one of the great unresolved issues of facing South Africa's multiple problems. That what could be a good relation, what could be a good relation with cooperation, and I'll say cooperation, not co-option, or there's another or collusion, is simply not in place. Anlu.
Terence, one of the things that I recently came across when looking at some of the concessions that we've actually seen, in specifically the transport sector. I'm not entirely sure if you can hear my dog barking. Apologies if you can. They are part of the household, of course. So, of course, South Africa has seen the logistics roadmap and the draft network statement that were delivered. But when we look at some of the reforms that are proposed or that are starting to be implemented in specifically the transport sector, I think it's important for us to also take a breath. And with us, I'm referring to businesses getting involved, private sector getting involved. It's wonderful and it's great, but we need the underlying foundation to be strong enough and to be sufficient to allow a sustainable system to be set up. And what I mean with this is we are at such a point that at a record rate, we have seen the logistics roadmap, we've seen the draft network statement, and we've seen the I almost want to say haphazard implementation of the opening of the transport sector. And it's wonderful to one extent, but on the downside of it is that, I don't know if it's getting too loud. Can you? Okay, I'll just.
No, it's audible, but we're here.
Great. One of the downsides of this is, of course, that we see on international experience that the actual liberalization of rail networks takes a lot longer and is a lot more complicated than the liberalization compared to that of air transport or electricity or gas markets. And in some countries, the research has shown that it's taken something between a decade or more for the first piece of legislation to be passed to the actual opening of the rail market. And then of course, third-party operators actually coming onto the network. So for us to genuinely see successful collaboration between businesses in talks with government and the actual integration of them on the networks, there's a series of things that we need to see actually happen, including things like having the policy framework that is needed to actually set in place the direction for future development as well, how these operators will actually be included, the risks that have to be shared appropriately, the pricing to users. So there's various things that we can't just haphazardly rush over. And for that reason, it's important to get business involved and to get business talking with government. In many of the improvements that we've seen, specifically in transport, we've seen them in talks with government. But we need these talks to happen on such a manner that it is actually sustainable and that it will actually build a foundation on which we can continue building them.
Okay. All right. I'm going to read one final question, and then I think we'll call it a day. Is there any evidence to suggest that the ideological fortress of government might be systematically penetrated by analysis, such as that represented by the IRR? Are we undermining the fortress?
I have to first start by asking you what exactly that question is asking. Is there any evidence to suggest that the ideological fortress of government might be systematically penetrated by the analysis, such as that represented by the IRR?
Are we changing minds of people who historically have not been receptive to these messages?
I have to undoubtedly say yes. And the reason for that is we have, as the Institute, firstly, we have the credibility that comes with being nearly 100 years old. But with that comes the adaptability of adjusting our communication to suit the day and age. And with that, I'm particularly referring to the campaigns that we are busy with. One of which is the What South Africa Can Be campaign. And I'm sure that if you have a look at our social media and our communications coming out of this week, you'll notice that it has a real infrastructure focus, and with that, a focus on local government and where local government has responsibility in infrastructure. So as part of these campaigns that we run, we communicate not only to people who agree with us, but we reach out to people who don't agree with us. And we've been in conversation with various government organizations. We've sent various letters and received various responses as well from parliamentarians straight through to business. And for that, I'd encourage you to have a look at our communications regularly. You're also welcome to subscribe, and we will share these newsletters with you that keeps you updated on the work that we are busy with. But it is almost more encouraging when we receive emails that don't agree with what we say than emails that agree with what we say, because we know then that we are reaching the correct audience. And I'm sure our colleagues, Terence, who keeps an eye on these newsletters and responses, will confirm that we have received various emails that perhaps concede and say, I have to agree. Perhaps I did not agree, but I have to now agree. So we are definitely putting in the effort to not only speak into the echo chamber of classical liberalism, but to also reach people who need to hear and who can potentially affect change. And that is everybody, straight from a voter who affects change through a vote, all the way to, I almost want to say, the president, which we have also written to. Yes, I would say there is evidence to suggest that the ideological fortress of government might be systematically penetrated by analysis.
Well, look, let me just close off by saying that we can't do this without the support of our supporters. Those of you who attend events like this, who circulate our material, and those of you who make small donations. Remember, no amount is too small. In fact, it's testimony to the fact that what we are doing is not just about large corporates or donor funding. It's also about what thousands and thousands of ordinary South Africans, see as an investment in their future. Look, I would just like to say that changing people's minds is a long-term thing. When we talk about penetrating that ideological fortress, it's not an earthquake; it's erosion. It's the slow drip of that tap that the government didn't bother to repair, that systematically chips a hole in the wall. I really wish that this was like the army marching around Jericho. They could blow its trumpets and the walls come tumbling down. But you mentioned that you mentioned the nearly 100 years of tradition. Well, things that were seen as inconceivable become common sense. This is not a task for the impatient, but it is a task that in which we are well practiced. And with that, I would like to thank everyone for being here. Thank you, Anlu. Thank you to Mbali behind the scenes, without whom none of this is ever possible. And yes, please feel free to go to our website, irr.org.za, to get a copy of the report available for download, and also to check out the dailyfriend.org.za, where we put up our daily writing. With that, thank you, and have a wonderful and productive day further.